again, if I were you, I would be downstairs at Justin Drake's Ethereum 3.0 announcement. But for the people that are here, thank you. I'm here to talk about sequencing and how it impacts you as an app developer and an app developer that potentially wants to build out an app chain. And my perspective, I think, is really niche because I worked both on the DA side. I worked as a contributor to a base rollup as well, and I also now am helping an organization that is launching their own chain. So I've been at 3 different points of the stack, and what I wanted to do with this talk is kind of provide information and public goods information that a lot of app chain developers and builders don't often have access to. And when they're building out their app chain, they oftentimes don't make the right choices or make significant trade-offs that can affect their users. So I'm super excited to chat more about this today, and let's do it. Okay, so what was the original kind of thesis and mission of sequencing? It originally, when L2s were being built, was this notion of being able to commit and batch transactions and organize them. So we know this kind of thesis of how you build out an L2 app chain today, and when you're deploying your smart contract, and when you're actually configuring the bridge contracts and asset transfers for this app chain. And this kind of developer flow that's been preconceived by the L2s, like OP, like Arbitrum. And I would say the issue with this is that a lot of these L2s are primarily running an independent or centralized sequencer in this process. So I'll go into why that impacts you as a potential app developer or developer building these app chains, but this kind of thesis of being able to control your sequencing affects your users and how they can submit transactions, how the transactions are confirmed and then executed, and then their overall user experience. Okay, so we had this original mission. That was kind of what sequencing looked like. And when the Ethereum roadmap mentioned the first couple high-level theses of sequencing a couple years ago, the overall mission was shared sequencing and decentralized sequencers. And we saw this with a lot of the research that came out of Scroll in the early days, and some research that was also coming out of Espresso and Astria, 2 different other shared sequencing protocols. And they really wanted to help users control their execution, give faster pre-confirmation times, and they also wanted to have a more competitive market for sequencing. At the time, there weren't a lot of options that were available, and this was giving a lot more power back to users. And this was very ambitious. And oftentimes, as we've seen, this means that the actual development or results or reality doesn't catch up to it, product development-wise. And what we've kind of seen lately or in the past year is that a lot of the L2s in the Ethereum ecosystem have centralized sequencers. They also have high fees, and they're predominantly focused on MEV extraction, or they have their own monopolies over certain rollups or app chains that are using them, and RASs also have huge monopolies. So a huge key point that I like to emphasize when I talk to other developers about this is a RAS called Conduit actually processes 42% of all Ethereum transactions. So when you think about that context, that's very powerful in the overall app chain development of Ethereum. So then how did sequencing progress from this original expectation and then now to the reality we're seeing? So we then saw multiple sequencing models emerge, and this kind of shared infrastructure. So Espresso, one of the Ethereum sequencers that I mentioned prior. They've been working with Arbitrum to have a client configuration where you can use stylus. There's a community-driven vision. So there's been multiple forum posts from L2s to allow people to have an opinion on sequencing. And a lot of them are also open sourcing this research so that others can contribute it to it. So I'd say now we've moved from that kind of pattern, and now there's kind of a profit concentration. And because of this, because there's only like 5 to 7 major players, this has created a market shift. And in this market shift, we're seeing that these L2s that were originally created to scale Ethereum, now their primary business model relies on sequencer profit. And what this means is that if you're an app chain developer or an app developer that's primarily relying on transaction fees or a portion of sequencer profit, if you, let's say, are a DeFi app, and this is important to you, this model doesn't necessarily benefit you as a user. So yeah, this is some of their average sequencing fees. I'd say OP and Arbitrum and Base have the highest fees generated in the past couple months. Base is a centralized sequencer, and they've shown and kind of advocated that in the end, users that are particularly building apps and services, they don't necessarily care about it being centralized. All they really do care about is pre-confirmation times and fast execution and access to a bridge, which they have an incredible developer experience to do so. So I think one thing when you're building out an app chain or using a lot of these L2s and deploying an app that would be sequencing transactions is to be mindful of the trade-offs of the overall developer experience and how that would affect your users. So this is kind of the composition of how L2s and overall Ethereum transactions are generating fees and kind of the distribution that you see in Ethereum specifically. So where did the market change? I love all the L2s in Ethereum. OP and Arbitrum specifically have contributed incredible public goods. And I think as they grew and developed more ecosystem development and grew in the number of apps and services that were predominantly using them, they kind of gatekeeped this notion of sequencing profit because that's their primary business model. So when they did so, and when a lot of rollups or L2s that are primarily following this business model for sequencer profit, block builders who also generate profit from building the blocks for these rollups also had the opportunity to extract value. And in doing so, users actually paid the price because the transaction fees actually increase when a lot of them started to enter the market. And what this meant is that a lot of the app builders that were building, let's say a DeFi app or an NFT app on top of these existing frameworks, is they had less control over the transaction costs of their own app chains or apps, and they also had less control over the confirmation and execution of the transactions that were being submitted. And then we had a third player, and this third player, they are taking a majority of the market. And I'd say the main player that I wanted to emphasize in this is Conduit. So Conduit is one of the major rollups as a service that emerged in Ethereum. We have other players like Gelato, Anchor, Caldera, and Aurora that's primarily on Near. And because they are this all-in-one deployment platform for deploying your app chain or app on these frameworks, they primarily take a large portion of your sequencer fees. And then Conduit recently also announced their G2 sequencer. So this G2 sequencer allows you to have a larger transaction size in kilobytes if you're processing larger transactions. And what this means is that you can have larger transactions that enhances your user experience, but they're taking a larger cut. And it's another advocate or example of how sequencer profit is now becoming this huge market for rollups as a service that have only recently entered the market. And secondary aspect would be that sequencing became profitable. So I think we saw maybe 2 to 3 years ago, these L2s, a lot of them had the proof systems that weren't in development or production yet. And now that there's real transaction volume, a lot of the sequencing profit helped them become profitable. And the market completely changed. So what this meant is that app chains started to get traction, and a lot of major teams that had existing apps like Uniswap, like the ENS announcement that was recent for Namechain, they started to deploy their own app chains. And what this meant is that previously, when you were building an app on these L2 frameworks, you did not have the power to configure or request changes to the L2 framework that you were using. You were really either running that sequencer client or deploying those contracts and then monitoring it with Grafana, like I mentioned prior. When now you had a full developer experience via a RAS, and then you also had the ability, based on the chain that you're deploying, to also negotiate a grant. And that goes into kind of the next wave that I wanted to articulate. So if you are someone that is either launching an app chain or wanting to use one of these frameworks or software or infrastructure to deploy your app, you now have the power. And hopefully this talk helps provide a public goods resource to how you can actually leverage your transaction volume or your users in this case. But builders now have financial power. So a lot of these L2s, they now want your transaction volume and users. And we've seen it with grant deals that are coming out like this. Like if you want to specifically work with OP or Arbitrum, a lot of the times if you have an application or app chain that is high volume, you can negotiate a grant. On the developer side, you're not in a place where you're just running a sequencer client and then just deploying contracts, and you're doing it in Docker and then running it in Grafana, and it's completely segmented, and there's no like central way to manage your developer experience. Now you kind of have the tools and infrastructure to manage that more adequately and to scale a whole team to manage that in a more secure way. And then they also got their technical power back. So this one is probably the one that makes me the most happy. Then we saw the emergence of app-based sequencing. And app-based sequencing is a really revolutionary concept. One of the best companies that is doing this is Shirella. And what app-based sequencing allows apps and app chains to do is it gives them the ability to then configure the kind of customizations that they want their specific app to have, and how, based on these prioritizations, the transactions are confirmed and then executed for their users. And what this results in is lower costs in transactions and then better user experience and happier users. And the second would be base sequencing. So this is coined by the lovely Justin Drake. One of my favorite companies that is doing this right now is Takeo, and it follows the consensus of the original L1, so that would be Ethereum. But what it allows you to do is actually process larger transactions, and they wouldn't be using the same system that we've seen primarily in an optimistic rollup. And the third would be RAS-based sequencing. So like I mentioned prior, we're now seeing a lot of these rollups as a service discover that they have a majority of the market on their platform. And what this means is that they can actually control the sequencing that is going through Ethereum. And they're now building their own sequencers. So Conduit has been the first, but there's many other rollups as a service that I've heard are also working on their own. So this is a great innovation because if you are, let's say, an application team that is less dev heavy and you don't have the opportunity to scale out a team that's more than 5 developers, this gives them the ability to have a sequencer that matches kind of the all-in-one deployment tool that they want to with RASes. So it's a really cool innovation, and I'm super excited to see how people use it. Yeah, so I would end this talk with kind of saying that build app chains that benefit you and your users, and now that we've kind of developed from the original sequencing thesis that we saw kind of 4 to 5 years ago to this user-centric sequencing thesis, remember that when you're building out your app or app chain, that you have the power to control how the transactions are both pre-confirmed and then executed on your chain. So that is my talk.
Thank you, thank you. I think since we just had some people trickle in, if anybody has a live question that you'd like to ask, I think we could hear everybody, so we can open it up to that. We'll give that a second. And then